Hello, my name is David Hunt and welcome to The Art Hunter. My guest today is soprano who started off with Australian Opera Company and then went into cabaret, won a Helpmann Award and has performed from Glastonbury to Carnegie Hall. Hello. Was artistic director at the Adelaide Cabaret Festival 2016 to 2018. Let's stop there because let's talk to the legend that is a superstar, Ali McGregor. Hello.
Hello, David. I'm not sure if I've quite reached legendary status, but I'll take it.
Yes, you have. Yes, you have. All right, let's start off opera singer.
Yes.
And England. Yes. Where did it happen? Did you go there to study?
I finished my study. I started studying at ANU in Canberra.
Yep.
And then went over to Europe to do some study in Italy. And while I was there, I thought I'm just going to apply for some of the music colleges, and ended up getting into the Royal Northern College of Music, which was in Manchester. So I finished my studies there and I ended up getting a scholarship for postgraduate, and then ended up starting working there. Weirdly enough, although I was still doing opera, I did a production at Wilton's Music Hall, which was this fantastic place in the East End of London, the oldest surviving music hall.
Oh.
And did this fantastic show and was scouted by an acting agent, and so started doing a lot of acting, and they had a whole section that just did TV commercials. So weirdly, I spent this year as a TV commercial actress. And while I was there, I auditioned for Simone Young, who was trying to look for, she was about to come back to Opera Australia and is looking for young artists and artists who were in Europe to bring back to Australia. And then I got the spot as one of her first young artists at Opera Australia. So I came back to Australia then, and then sort of everything started.
Right.
No more TV commercials.
No more TV. Although it would have been good grounding, I suppose, wouldn't it?
Paid better than opera ever has as well.
Exactly. Have you ever thought of going back doing something like that, or have you totally moved
totally,
on?
Except that when I was then in my mid-20s, and I was playing young mums, and then by the time I was a young mum, I was too old to play young mums. So now I'm just waiting for the grandma roles. I'll just wait. I'm probably only a couple of years away from that.
I think you're a little bit more than that.
Well, possibly, but as far as TV
ads,
goes, I think, yeah.
So Opera Australia,
yes.
Let's talk about that. How prestigious to be part of, a world famous opera company and a home opera company.
It was very exciting. When I was studying in Canberra, we used to come up and see the dress rehearsals at Opera Australia, and it was always such a thrill. I remember seeing Baz Luhrmann's Midsummer Night's Dream there, and so many productions.
Yeah.
And then I remember the very first day I went and I auditioned. Well, I guess I sang for Simone in England, but at some point I remember auditioning at the Opera Australia, and I went and got a little sandwich and I sat up sort of overlooking on that, I was sort of Bennelong Point overlooking the Opera House, and just had this God, imagine I might get to sing inside there.
Whoa.
And so then I was with Opera Australia for 5.5 years, and as a young artist I did 25 roles, I think, in that time, a lot of understudying and smaller roles. It was the most amazing grounding for being a performer, and a singer, and working with an extraordinary array of artists and directors and conductors, and it was an extraordinary experience. But it was also probably the hardest work I've ever done as a performer. It was very much 3 productions at a time, very different types of singing. I did get a little bit of burnout, I think, after a while.
Well, the discipline of an opera singer, all the classical, like being in an orchestra as well, just rehearsal, like study. It's tough, isn't it?
It is tough, and I'd just spent the last few years in my 20s in London and hanging out in Ibiza and going, I wasn't prepared for how hard I had to work and how little social life I could afford myself. So, but it was very good, and that discipline has, done me well.
Yeah,
since.
And of course it would. All of a sudden you'd start getting interested in, cabaret and a little bit of burlesque. Where did that come from and why?
Before I left the UK, the last production I did there, as I said, Wilton's Music Hall, I ended up doing 2 productions there. And one of them was a version of The Beggar's Opera. And Jonathan Miller directed it, and he was a very famous director who, as you probably know, but he was also, he was in Beyond the Fringe with Dudley Moore and Peter Cook. He was also a neurologist and neuroscientist. He was the most incredible brain.
Oh, okay.
And he used to sit there in our breaks in Wilton's and tell us the story of this music hall, and tell us how these opera singers from Covent Garden used to finish, the chorus girls used to finish their opera. They'd take off their outer clothes, put a cloak on, hop in a carriage, go to the East End of London and sing their arias for the vaudeville public. And they would be thrown sort of money and flowers, and they'd earn more money in there than they would at Covent Garden. And this image, I think, always stayed with me really viscerally. And I started reading up on musical and vaudeville and early burlesque. And in the European tradition of burlesque, it was satirising popular music of the day. And then when it sort of went to America, it became, you know, more of a sort of bump and grind burlesque that we know today. I was really fascinated with all of that. And I went to LA, and there's a Velvet Hammer Burlesque. I started seeing, it was really the explosion of burlesque. It was just sort of starting out. And yeah, it really, I just found it so, from being on opera where there's quite often there's this fourth wall, you don't really have much to do with the audience. And I realised that whenever I did have something to do with the audience, that's what I really loved. That sort of dialogue. And that's what I was seeing in sort of burlesque and cabaret and all that, was that dialogue with an audience. And so later on down the line, I was performing at the Art Centre here in Melbourne, and we're doing Manon, and I was always playing some sort of loose woman. I was playing some sort of courtesan or something, and Poussette, I think her name was. And we had the wigs and the big dresses and everything. And after rehearsals one night, I came outside, and the Spiegel tent was parked on the forecourt, and they had that beautiful tram bar.
Oh, that's right.
And one night I was in there with a friend having a drink, and I had this necklace on, and I must have been playing with it. It fell down the grill in the bottom of this bar. So I was trying to get it out, and these two gentlemen who'd been sitting nearby came and helped me. And afterwards, we got it out. I said, "Can I buy you a drink?" And thank you for your help. And it turns out it was David Bates, who owns the Spiegel tent, and Ross Mollison, who's a great producer who's now in Vegas. And we got talking, and I told them this story of these girls in Wilton's Music Hall. And they thought it was fascinating. And David said, I said, "Oh, well, I'm doing this opera now." And he said, "Well, why don't you one night take off your outer clothes and sneak over into the Spiegel tent and sing something for us in what was then called Club Swizzle." And that's exactly what I did. I got the props department to help me. I got an old kids, you know those shell, the swimming pools? Shell swimming pools that you buy from Bunnings. We put all sort of paint and stuff on it, made it look like a big Venus shell. And I came out of that like the birth of Venus and sang. And I got 4 people from the chorus, and they were palm fronds and feeding me grapes. And I sang this aria. And I think I just followed a sword swallower and something else. And it was just, I was just like caught the bug. And I couldn't wait to get part of it. And then David said to me that Camille O'Sullivan, who was currently in their house show, which was called La Clique at the time, had to go back to Ireland, and would I step in so I went to the Edinburgh Festival and did the tail end of that season there, and then sort of started performing with that. And at the time, it was the perfect time because Opera Australia, Simone Young had left, Richard Hickox had come in, and as quite often happens, certainly the young sopranos in a company, they've sort of been, used them as much as they can, and they have another fresh lot of young sopranos. So there wasn't, one door had closed, and I saw this door opening in this beautiful tent, and I ran towards it and never looked back.
And because for the people that don't know, that Spiegel tent tours the world. You know, it's a famous.
And it is called the famous Spiegel tent. And at that time, again, it was one of the only tents in circulation, certainly outside Europe, and not being necessarily used to do wine tasting and stuff, and that started a bit of an explosion of Spiegel tents. So now you can't go to a festival without seeing a Spiegel tent. But at the time, that was a real anomaly. I'd never heard that before. And the famous Spiegel tent would actually go into a cart and go to Edinburgh, and it was wonderful because I remember one night being late night in the Spiegel tent and bumping into a friend of mine, a Melbourne friend of mine, and we were chatting, and then halfway I went, "Wait a sec, what are you doing here in Edinburgh? Because you just forget where you were because you could be anywhere. It was the same floor, the same walls. And it felt a little bit like a sort of Aladdin carpet, and it just could fly off and you'd be anywhere, and anything could happen. It was a wonderfully
would have been. And who was one of the first people to perform in it back when it was first built?
Well, that particular Marlene Dietrich has certainly performed in it, and a huge amount of people that we probably don't even know, because I don't think records were necessarily kept of all those late night shenanigans. So, and that stage, Le Clique then became La Soiree, and that went on to win Olivier's and all sorts of stuff. That was after my time in it, but again, that sort of Carney or classy Carney family became my family, and that's certainly, as I've gone into cabaret, that's where I come from and where my sort of cabaret ethos comes from. I think is that kind of.
I can remember you saying to me one time that your kids grew up in the out the back of theatres, and they're real Carney kids per se.
Certainly my eldest,
which is a beautiful, does she remember it now? Or?
She does a bit. I remember her going on tour with me around sort of regional Victoria, and it was just me and her and the band, and we would get to a town, and I would usually run ahead and say, do you have someone got a teenage daughter or something who wants to do a bit of babysitting? And so while we did sound check, she would play off with this teenage daughter, and they'd just go for a walk or something, and then we'd all go for dinner together. And then we'd come back, and I would set up I had a little fold-out bed, like a little cushion thing, and I would put that in my dressing room, and I'd read her a story, and then I'd walk out on stage, and this sort of teenager would sit with her, and she'd go to sleep listening to us on stage. And then, I'd carry her back to the motel, and she'd eat, Wheat Bix in a cup. That's the thing she remembers, is Wheat Bix in a cup.
Okay.
It was very exciting with sugar on it. She thought it was the most exciting thing in the world. And and she loved it. She loved being part of that. I think by the time my youngest was born, it was 2, and but there's been lots of Carney. And when I was pregnant with my second, I did a lot of performing. I did a whole season of my late night variety night in Edinburgh when I was about 6-7 months pregnant. And with my first child, I've got this fantastic photo of me at the Melbourne International Comedy Festival. It was a kiss night, and I had the kiss makeup on, and I was singing I Was Made for Loving You, and I think I gave birth a couple of weeks after that photo was taken. So they've been very much part of my journey.
Let's talk about the Edinburgh Festival. You've been so many times and quite well known.
Yeah, look, I haven't been back for a little bit. I think I did 12 years all up, with a break in between. Didn't always do a full season of my show. I sometimes came and did, a week of a solo show, and then did spots here and there. But really, it formed me as a cabaret artist, absolutely. I remember saying to someone who was complaining about how much money they had, were spending and not making in Edinburgh. And I said, I think for a certain type of performer, it's like your postgraduate degree.
Yep.
And people will invest a lot of money in a university course. And I think you just have to see it as that.
True.
And because one thing, although in opera I had learnt a lot about, being a very disciplined singer and everything, what I didn't know and I didn't appreciate was what went on behind the scenes and what it took to get that opera up on the... And I think sometimes I had behaved, I look back on it now, in a rather sort of myopic way, and I do see it now with some stage performers who've never had to self-produce, is you're always complaining about, why didn't, and that I didn't get this and I didn't get that, and then, you're complaining that the marketing team haven't given you an article, I don't know, there's a million things to complain about. And then when you actually have to self-produce and you have to sell your own tickets and do your own marketing and go out there and flyer, and you can see what your tech crew are doing in the 15-minute bump in they have before your show, you're so much more aware of what it takes, and I have a lot more respect for the workings and the backstage workings and the people who work there, where they were kind of invisible to us, when you're in a big behemoth like Opera Australia.
Absolutely.
So I think that formed me very much as much more of a all-round, showgirl.
Yeah, showgirl.
If you will.
And talking about self-producing and coming, you're such an ideas person. You're a real ideas person. So your late night variety at the Comedy Festival, Melbourne International Comedy Festival.
Yeah.
How many years have you done it?
I think it was 15 this year, I
Wow.
think. Although we didn't have last year.
No.
I just pretend like that didn't happen.
Well, I think everyone
does.
does.
I did take 1 year off the year before because I thought, I'll take a year off. And
it won't matter.
Yeah, exactly. So that was 2. But that piece also was born out of that research into early burlesque and vaudeville, because one thing that came up in the vaudeville, especially in England, there was these impresarios who they ran a beautiful big theatre, and they'd have these shows on, and there was one in particular, he had a throne set up on the side of the stage and a gavel like a judge. And, they would have, those shows would go for hours. They'd eat up there and, talk through the show and just acts would be coming on and on and on. And the audience would watch, and if this impresario liked it and was laughing, they would kind of go, let's put this beer down and stop the conversation and see what's happening.
Yeah.
And if the impresario didn't like it, he would hit the gavel and they would just go off mid-act. And I just thought that, again, that interaction between the audience and people on stage, and having this person as a conduit between what was happening on stage and the audience, was just a really delightful idea. So the first season we did upstairs at the Athenaeum, and I didn't think I could host then, so I sat on my chaise longue on the side of the stage, and I had like Hamish and Andy hosted, and Julia Zamiro, and gosh, I can't remember who the other guests host. I think Michelangelo, and we had guests on, and I didn't ever use the gavel. I only booked good acts. I didn't have the heart to get anyone else. And then after that, I think it was more of a cost-cutting exercise. I was just like, I'll post it. And then as it grew, I just would play my auto harp and stuff. And then as it grew, we got the band. And so for the last, 6-7 years, I think I've been, probably longer actually, been in the famous Spiegel tent with the full band, and it's become a real thing now, which is great.
It really has.
Yeah.
So tell people that might not understand what it is, how do you choose the people that are on the show, because late night show? Are they performing as part of the comedy festival?
It's all handpicked, and it's usually. When I started, I couldn't afford to pay any of the guests. So it was like, you're doing a show at the Comedy Festival. Do you want to come and promote the show? Which is absolutely what you do in these festivals. I cut my teeth doing, 4 free spots a night in Edinburgh. And you go and you do your free spot, you hand out flyers, and it's a really great way of getting people to come to your show. And I used to just pay them in. I used to make a little lolly, like a sweet bag, like you go to a birthday party, and they would all get their little sweetie bag. I remember when I first started paying people for that show, someone turned up and was like, where are the sweets? And that was the only reason he'd come to do the show, because he said, it would get me through, and now and then I'd be having a really bad time, and I'd look in my bag and, there were some musk sticks, and it was great. But so it would generally be, I think nowadays we have about 4 acts a night. I try and give a bit of variety, so I'll always have a stand-up, cabaret act. I'll have what I call the fancy act, which is circus or burlesque, and then we'll have one other act who's a bit more of a headliner of whatever sort of genre. And then in between I'll sing songs. So nowadays I do pay my acts, but generally it's people from around the festival, but now and then if I can get some other fantastic act who's just in town, or someone who I can just convince to come up and do a song for us. If Tim Minchin's in town, I'll bend his arm and he'll get up there. So generally people from the festival, but then... But
you would know so many of them, wouldn't you? Over the years, you would have just got to know them. Yeah, as I said, it's this real classy Carney family, and doing Edinburgh and stuff, and you'd be in Montreal, or you'll be somewhere in London, and you get to know everyone. And so I kept that little Rolodex, that virtual Rolodex, pretty full, and I only ever book people I really like, because I'm on stage watching them, so I'm not going to book someone. And I have no poker face, if I'm not liking it, I want to be, you always know it's a good, if I cry an eyelash off, that's the test. And people have got to know that. If I'm sticking my eyelashes on, I've cried myself silly, laughed myself silly. But I sort of pride myself on, look, I know my taste is not for everyone, but the people who come to the show come because they do tend to like what I like.
and they know what they're going to get. There'll be people they've never heard of, but they kind of trust that it's going to be someone they like.
Yeah.
So I always make sure I don't ever book anyone I don't know that is going to really fit the kind of audience.
Yeah.
So there's some acts I really love who I can't really book on. Like say Sam Simmons. I love Sam Simmons, comedian. But my audience just don't tend to, he's quite surreal and don't tend to get him.
Right.
So I sort of was like, there's a few acts that I love, but I just don't necessarily work in that format for my audience, which is slightly older than some of the other sort of composite shows in the comedy festival.
Yeah. Which is good for the comedy festival instead of it all geared to younger people, because
Totally.
you know, like people grew up with the comedy festival and they still want to go to it. Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. And the older people buy more expensive booze from the bar as well, so
Exactly.
everyone's a winner. You know?
Now, we touched on the fact that you're very creative and you come up with some great ideas and concepts. She's busy. One in particular, it's some sort of very exotic foreign person that was really big back 30, 40 years ago that you did a show about. Do you still do it? Who might that be?
Do you know what I was thinking then? I had Barry Crocker on my show. Is that who you're talking about?
No.
So no, I developed a real fascination for this 1950s Peruvian singer, Yma Sumac. And it started, someone made me a mini disc because I was pretty cool in the late 90s. I don't know if you were too, but I used to have a mini disc player. And a friend of mine who loved music as well, he'd always just be putting a whole bunch of music on there. And around about this time, it was lounge music was having a bit of a resurgence. And there's a whole bunch of French DJs who started making these remixes of kind of old 50s lounge music. And there was I think it was called Mambo Exotica, a compilation. And there was this song. I remember loving the song, and there was this sample, and I didn't know if it was a computer trickery or an instrument or voice. And it just really stuck with me, and I didn't know much about it, and it took a couple of years, I think. This was, I'm talking kind of mid-90s that I first heard this. And then I remember hearing it on an ad. I'd hear this voice every now and then and be like, what is that? Finally found out it was this Peruvian singer, Yma Sumac, who had a 4.5 octave range, and there had been rumours that she was actually Amy Camus, a bored housewife from Brooklyn, who, was pretending to be this Peruvian singer. And I started looking into her, and I found online a guy who said he was her personal assistant when she passed away in 2008, and she'd left her whole archive to him, which I think at the time had been a bit of a burden. She kept everything, containers of costumes and memorabilia and everything. And Dita Von Teese had actually helped out and lent some storage in return for some costumes, I think. And I contacted him, and I was saying how I'd been trying out this, what we call whistle tone in my own voice, which I'd done as a joke one night in Edinburgh when I just did a sped up version of Oops, I Did It Again by Britney Spears, and for laughs. And then started going, I think I might be able to do something with this. And so I contacted him, and I bought a couple of pieces of jewellery and an old piece of costuming. And then I started chatting to him about, I was just really fascinated by it all, and he started chatting, and he was actually having a really hard time of it at the time, and he said, look, I've got one more box of her kind of, other than the really important stuff, one more box of just stuff to sell, and then I'm just going to take a step back. And I said, well, why don't I just buy that box off you, and then you don't have to faff about with all, because he was doing his head and go to the post office, I think, mostly. And so I did, and my mother-in-law was in America to visit her son, my brother-in-law, and she said, I'll just bring it back in my suitcase. So, this sort of box arrived, and I remember opening and I could smell her. It was extraordinary.
Whoa.
And there was actually some of her sort of everyday, these beautiful blouses had been made in Japan, and bits of jewellery and costuming and random stuff. And I think that was the real moment where I was like, this is a real person. And I really wanted to know about her. And she had a really fascinating life. She had a classic story of a woman creative being taken advantage of by a man. Her husband was a bit of a Svengali type, I guess. would sort of say that her success was all based on him, and he, you know, did the arrangements. A lot of her vocals were improvised though, but she never really got that credit, I think, early on. And then I was under the impression she had this son, and then it turned out, I found out that she had acted like it was her son, but it was actually her. They toured with her cousin. I don't think they were actually related, but she'd grown up with, and she was the dancer in the trio, and it was her son that he'd been having an affair with, and just because they were about to hit the big time, she said it was her son. And I just thought, God, what a fascinating, there's so much more to explore there. So that's what I created the show to explore, not only this extraordinary music, but just this extraordinary woman, because it really rang true for me that there was a lot of really extraordinary women who didn't always get the credit, and you know, and that they were she was sort of seen as a bit of a novelty, but she was actually an extraordinary musician.
But she was very popular though, wasn't she?
She was the highest selling recording act for Capitol Records in the 50s, and they had Bing Crosby and stuff, so she was huge. But then like lounge at the end of the 50s, like in the 60s, it was all rock and roll, and lounge music became a bit naff, and you know, then near the end of her life, there was this resurgence, and she did this trippy album in the late 70s called Miracles, and then she ended up going to Germany because someone did a remix, some German techno DJ did a remix of one of her songs, and she started doing the rounds of these German TV shows. And then there's this one clip that people always send me, go, have you seen this? And of course I have it. It's a clip of her storming off stage on a German variety show, and you could just, and more I read about it now, about how she really didn't feel she had control over what was happening, and there was just a lot of people taking advantage of her, I think, throughout her life. But she was a formidable woman. So it's really fabulous, and I'm still in a lot of dialogue with her personal assistant. We still talk a lot, and I helped him get an exhibition of her costumes up in London.
Yeah.
It was actually it was an exhibition about Peruvian textiles, and so we got some of her work shown there. And yeah, I'd love, you know, hopefully when everything, we were meant to be doing the Arts Centre last year, and we've yet to find another date for that. So that show has a lot more life in it, I think.
How popular has it been though?
Well, I won a Helpmann, so
hello.
You know, it's been okay. No, we debuted at Adelaide Cabaret Festival, then we took it to Sydney Opera House, and that was extraordinary because, unbeknownst to me, there was a group of Peruvians who live in Sydney.
Oh, okay.
And they'd all got together and bought tickets to the show, and they were all sitting in the front row. And I didn't know that till near the end. Someone waved a Peruvian flag, and I was like, "Oh, that's a Peruvian flag." And they were like, "Yeah, we are all," like the first 2 rows were all Peruvian. And then I started to get really nervous. I was like, "Oh my God, you probably know so much more about her." And they were lovely. They handed me one of the flags. They said, "You're an honorary Peruvian." They said, no one tells her story. She was kind of dismissed a little bit even in Peru as being someone who maybe sold out to Hollywood, and because a lot of her music, she started singing Peruvian traditional music, and then when they went to Hollywood, they just wanted a kind of mismatch of exotica. So, you know, they did this mambo, and that wasn't really her thing, and it would have these African drums and stuff, and it was a bit of a pastiche. I love it. I think it's camp, I love it, but she tended to not sing those songs later on in her life because I think she was a bit, she felt as well that she saw herself as a very serious artist. Yeah. But they were just chuffed that someone was talking about this Peruvian singer that not many people knew about, and they'd all grown up with their parents listening to the records and stuff. So that was a real treat actually doing it.
And Ali, it must be so fantastic for you to have this show that has done so well, an award-winning show, and you know it's got life. You know, it's still got legs for years to come. And you know, like, that's your creative mind. So congratulations on that.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, we actually did first work in progress in this very room.
Right.
So it's nice coming back.
Wow, fantastic.
And I wear all the jewellery I wear in that show is hers.
Oh.
So I own a lot of it.
Was that in the box?
No, some of it, but the good stuff I'd bought separately.
Okay.
And Damon had given me a couple of really prized things, a cuff and these beautiful earrings that were her favourite. And I even now own her old makeup box, and I've got all her old makeup. So.
Oh wow.
Yeah, I use one of the eyeshadows. The rest I don't really want to touch.
Oh
but,
no.
But when we were at the Sydney Opera House, they had some of that stuff displayed in cabinets.
Oh okay.
There,
lovely.
Which was fascinating because people love seeing.
Yeah.
You know, and I've got her old corset. I've got her support pants. true story.
I hope they were washed before you got
No,
them.
they were actually unopened. She had this, that was
Oh.
obviously a brand she really liked.
Yeah,
And so she had,
so
they were all kind of still folded beautifully
Yeah.
in this little container.
lovely.
And yeah, they're fab.
Okay, I've got to ask, which I mentioned in the intro, Glastonbury to Carnegie Hall. So tell us.
Do you want to know those two?
Yeah.
So when I climbed out of the Opera House into the Spiegel tent, before I joined La Clique, I started a show called the Opera Burlesque, and it was based on these opera singers that used to leave Covent Garden, take off their outer clothes.
Yep.
And it was myself, Dimsy Shepherd, Antoinette Haller, and 3 opera singers, and we did a show doing a mix of famous operatic arias with a twist, and then doing like pop songs like TNT by AC/DC as a Wagnerian kind of call to arms, and and Like a Virgin in Italian, like a sort of madrigal.
Awesome.
And we did that show, and I ended up doing that in Edinburgh with a different cast, and then we got booked at Glastonbury, and it was a really notorious space called Las Vegas and Glastonbury, and it seemed almost like a separate festival to the main Glastonbury. The year we went and did that, though, it rained.
Oh, well,
non-stop.
doesn't it rain every year?
And it was pretty much, and then it was mud. I remember we had gigs at a different place, and I remember in this tutu and a corset and Wellington boots, holding my auto harp and trudging through this mud, because it stopped raining, it was just like mud, to this other venue. Yeah, it was, that was really fun, but also really not very glamorous in any way whatsoever. I remember Shirley Bassey sang that year, and they'd given her bejeweled Wellington boots.
That's right,
Well,
yes.
gave me bejeweled Wellington boots. I think she got there on a golf cart too. She never trudged through the mud. And then Carnegie Hall was fairly recently, and that was a real highlight.
Who did you meet? Who did you?
Well, it was Michael Feinstein.
Oh, excuse me.
He came and did Adelaide Cabaret Festival.
Of
This was
course.
before I was artistic director there. And he and his husband Terence, I just got to know really well. And I think we were just, the last night of that festival, we said, actually, we're in LA next week. And they said, come and visit. And so we got there, and I gave him a buzz, and he was like, actually, we leave tomorrow on tour. Come over tonight for dinner. There's someone here I'd love you to meet. And so we went over to, and he lived in, they've actually moved now, but he lived in what was the old Russian embassy in Los Feliz in LA. And it was, huge. And we rock up, and first we was like, I'll show you around. And he takes us down into the basement, which I don't know what the Russians did in that basement, but what he has, he's the keeper of the Gershwin archive. The Gershwin family now, he has the keeper of the Gershwin archive, and he is a collector, and that basement is full of the most extraordinary memorabilia.
Yeah.
And then he showed us around this just amazing stuff, and then he said, we're being joined by a good friend of mine, Patricia. Anyway, didn't really tell us too much about Patricia, and she was gorgeous, early 50s, beautiful, and she was hilarious, and we ended up going to this fantastic place down in LA where this really sort of cheesy jazz duo play, and it's straight out of kind of 70s LA. I loved it so much. Drank apple martinis and just listened to this jazz. Anyway, got talking to Patricia, and it turns out she was Gene Kelly's widow. So Gene Kelly's second wife, I think, and she was 47 years his junior.
Yeah.
Was actually started as she was writing a biography on him, and they fell in love, and quite an extraordinary relationship. And she now is sort of the keeper of the Gene Kelly archive, and she performs this fantastic talk and show with orchestras around the world. And she was just fascinating. And then I'm deviating from the story slightly, but only because it's a really good deviation, in that she ended up saying, I think afterwards, Michael and Terence had left, and we said to Patricia, I'll come out to dinner, because we wanted to take some friends back to this place, and she came out, had a great night. She goes, well, to thank you for that dinner, can I invite you to the Playboy Mansion on Sunday night? Because Hugh puts on he loves film noir, and every Sunday night he invites just a select few people, and they come and we watch a film noir and we have a little buffet dinner.
Whoa.
So we're like, yeah, of course we want to do that. So we turn up, and it was 30 people, a few of his girlfriends, and there was all these kind of like the guy who created Baywatch. It was so random. And Hugh's there in his robe, and he meets you and you get a photo taken, and then he reads he loves film noir, and so before the movie starts, he reads from his little foolscap pages some notes about the piece. And then afterwards he he showed us around his quarters at the back, including his massive. I always love saying that Hugh Hefner showed me his massive organ, but he literally, they used to put films on and they would play the organ.
Oh, okay.
And we had this extraordinary. So that meeting with Michael has led to so many things, but we kept in touch. And Michael, I brought him back to Adelaide Cabaret when he does a Frank Sinatra show when I was artistic director there. And afterwards, he said, I do this series at Carnegie Hall. Would you come and perform there? And I was like, oh, tadoi. And he was doing Harold Arlen show. And I flew over and sang in that. And then in that same trip, he took me to Pasadena. He's the artistic director of the Pasadena Pops Orchestra. And we did this, I sang some of my Yma Sumac material and on this big outdoor stage in Pasadena, which was extraordinary. And in fact, one of the guys working on it goes, oh, my mum wants to meet you because she went to school with Yma's son. And I'm like, this is crazy.
Yeah.
So that Carnegie Hall was pretty special.
Walking on that stage, like I've done a tour where you walk out on the stage and it's spectacular looking out.
It is spectacular. I do have to put a little note that it wasn't the main big room. There's a second room, which is still pretty big and still pretty impressive. And it's still Carnegie Hall.
It's still Carnegie Hall.
But it wasn't that big room, but it was still pretty awesome. And Harold Allen's sister was there. It was very cool.
Okay. You have mentioned a couple of times Adelaide Cabaret Festival, artistic director for a few years.
3 years.
Fantastic. Tell us about it, because it's so prestigious now, isn't it, that Cabaret Festival?
Yeah, look, I mean, when I started performing there, I just was blown away because for me, cabaret, not many people know how to define cabaret, and it's taken me, I think everyone has their own definition of it. It's taken me a while to know, but I have a real passion for it because it has this intimacy that not all art forms have. And for me, it's also this genre that it sits in the cracks in between the main genres. And I always find stuff that sits between the cracks, stuff that's not easily identifiable or not easily, you can't put it directly in a little box, is always the most fascinating stuff to me, is always the most visceral. And so you can have shows that are music, but you couldn't just say that they're live music. There's something else to them that you could, maybe there's a dance element, maybe there's a storytelling element. And then the same thing with theatre. Maybe there's a show and there's got a lot of music in it and there's no fourth wall, or you've got dance that has something else. It's very hard to define, and therefore I think really eclectic and interesting. And so I'd done it for a few years myself as a performer, and I was gunning for that job, David. I don't think I've ever done for anything. I made a little website about what my festival would look like and sent it to them. And I was like, these are the people I would book, and this is what I want the marketing to look like. I was, gung-ho. And then when they approached me and they said, we really chat to you about artistic directing, but we have also been chatting to Eddie Perfect. And I knew Eddie pretty well by that stage. We'd known each other about 10 years. And I was like, yeah, we had a different experience, but really similar taste. So that was actually really good because, there was stuff that Eddie brought to the table I wouldn't have thought of, and vice versa. And so we did that together for 2 years. And then the last year, Eddie was busy, I don't know, Beetlejuice, Broadway, whatever. And I did the third year on my own.
Wow,
so,
fantastic.
Yeah, it was great. It was the best job of my life, the hardest job of my life, really, really hard work. And I threw myself into that, probably more than they wanted, frankly, before I asked for. But I like to have, I like to be part of every part of it, where the marketing or how the venues get dressed. And for me, it's a little bit like an extension of my late night Variety Night. Like Variety Night, for me, a big part of that is when acts come on, they're offered a drink and they have their little lolly bag. And when I get on stage, they come out to a stage where that audience knows how much I love them. And so they're walking out into a stage where they already feel like they're loved. And for me, that's what the Cabaret Festival is, that hospitality part of it. You go there, the audience are primed, they trust you as a programmer, that they know they're going to love this stuff, that you're not just booking any old crap. And so it's an extremely loyal, really open-minded audience. And I just had the opportunity. It was like you know, people play fantasy football leagues or whatever. This was like my fantasy cabaret league, and I kind of got to have most of my top picks. There was a few we couldn't get for various reasons, but yeah, it was an extraordinary experience. But you know, my liver paid a really heavy price. My God, those 3 weeks. I used to be a wreck of a person after that, but you've got to keep everyone entertained.
Absolutely, come on.
And I had a gin sponsor. I had to get the word out.
All right, your creative mind again, and you come up with this concept, which you got other people to help you with it. Something about sirens?
My Lorelei opera. I love how you just like, you use like cryptic crossword clues, and then I have to fill in there. I like you're sort of pretending you don't know.
I don't know anything. Yeah.
So again, back with the Opera Burlesque, after we did that show, which was a sort of pastiche show, and I was really fascinated when I was studying music on the Lorelei Myth, because a lot of German Lied was written about the Lorelei Myth, and for anyone who doesn't know, it's German folkloric myth about a beautiful. There's a rock on the Rhine River coming in from the sea where a lot of shipwrecks happened, and a lot of the sailors would say that they were distracted or they were drawn towards the rock by this beautiful woman singing this song. The story went that she was a real woman whose lover had gone off to sea, and she was bereft, and she was beautiful, and all the men in the surrounding area fell head over heels in love with them, and she spurned them all, and they all went crazy.
Yep.
And so the bishop said, well, all the men are going crazy. What we should do, obviously, is lock her up in a nunnery, because it's obviously her fault. And they did, and then at some point there's various stories, whether she threw herself off the rock or she fell off the rock. And then it's her ghost singing this beautiful song and drawing the sailors to their death. It has connotations of the sirens, it has connotations of mermaids, but it also just always struck me as, why are we blaming this beautiful young woman for these, you know, men being idiots? So I was fascinated with that side of it, and I was going to do a show where we took all that music that had been written about sirens and Lorelei and do a show about it. And then for one reason or another, we all got busy and did different things, and we never ended up doing that. And then I was sitting in Victorian Opera did a production of Seven Deadly Sins with Meow Meow, and they did a second act, which was a new work where they asked 3 composers to write little bits based on the Seven Deadly Sins based on the cities of Australia, if that makes sense. So like gluttony was South Australia, and greed was New South Wales, all that, you know, Sydney and everything. And there was a couple of movements I really loved musically, and I said to Libby Hill, the general manager of VO at the time, and I said, you know, I'd really like. She was like, oh, they were both written by the same guy, a guy, Julian Langdon. He's a composer. You know, Richard's taken him under his wing. He's a great composer. And so I was like, And then I don't know what, I think maybe sitting there, I was just like, maybe I should revisit that idea, but actually get an opera written for the 3 of us. So yeah, I met up with Julian and sort of put this idea to him. I had a kind of idea of how I wanted the story to be, with these 3 women sort of each displaying different characteristics of how women get put in their boxes, and you're either the innocent, or you're the slut, or you're the old crone. You know, you had these, and looking at that. But I'm not a writer, and so I went first off to Casey Bonetto, who wrote Keating, who I've worked with a lot and just loved his mind. And then we went to Gillian Cosgriff, who was another musical comedian writer who I loved. And we convinced Victorian Opera to commission it. And so Casey, Gillian got along really well, which was fantastic. I brought along Sarah Giles, a Melbourne-based director whose work I really liked, and who, I remember putting a call out on Facebook or something like, what female directors in Melbourne do you think are good? And like 4 people went back, Sarah Giles. Sarah Giles. She brought along Marg Hoyle and Paul Jackson, Paul doing lighting and Marg doing the design. And it was just a perfect storm of all these people. I stepped away and I just went, I'm leaving it in their hands. And what they put and what they came up with was a really, truly extraordinary piece. And we debuted it at Victorian Opera 2018, and then with all various cancellations and reschedulings, we finally got to do it for Opera Queensland earlier this year in March. And then we've just done another season here for Victorian Opera at the Palais, so almost on the rock over the sea.
Yes.
And that show is growing and becoming more nuanced as time goes on, and I have big plans for that. So I've actually formed a company now because I want to do this more, create new work for the operatic stage in Australia that has, again, I'm getting comedy and, musical writers and just trying to expand what opera can be and the stories we can tell and stories that feel really relevant to us. As an opera singer, pretty much all of my characters got killed or raped or, forgotten about by Act 2. And so it was really great to have a show where there's 3, let's face it, middle-aged women singing about killing the audience, I guess, but, about female agency. And it was a really extraordinary thing to be part of.
Yeah.
And it really hit a nerve. A lot of people we had a woman in Brisbane in her 70s who said that she now has got together with a group of other like-minded women and they call it doing a Lorelei. They went in the Women's March. They've started volunteering for a women's shelter. It's been really fantastic. So the conversation starter and a really fantastic thing to be part of. And I love opera, but it also really infuriates me sometimes because I feel like sometimes it just feels like it's not kind of moving with the times.
Yeah.
Or if it is, they think they just have to sort of either do music theatre or just put a leather jacket on and that will update it. And I feel like we can do more. We can do better.
Well, okay, nice little segue, and you mentioned it.
Put it on a plate and serve it to you.
And you've just launched some wonderful new plans. What are you doing?
So I created a company called Fluxus with my longtime collaborator Wendy Richards, and doing exactly what I did with Lorelei, working with opera companies, putting together creative teams, and creating new work. So we already have a piece that we're working with Opera Queensland on at the moment, another one-act opera. At the moment, I like concentrating on one-act operas, nothing more than 75 minutes.
Okay.
Smallish in scope, because the trouble is opera companies have created new Australian work in the past, in the last few years, not a huge amount, but they have. But they don't have the facilities within that company to take that any further. So they'll do one season, which might only be 3 or 4 shows, and then you never hear of them again.
I hate that.
And it's really upsetting. And they want to do something, but they don't have the personnel. They don't have the money or time. I want to create work that we can, and I know from doing festivals that sort of hour-long, hour and a half is good for a festival because people sometimes like to see more than one thing in a night. Opera companies could also take those and do a double bill. But I want to give these shows life. So we have great plans now. We've taken over Lorelei from Victorian Opera now, and we'll be taking that hopefully around Australia and when we can. The
world?
Well, when we can, yeah.
When you can,
I think it's a few people have said, oh my God, this needs to be at the Barbican in London, it needs to be BAM, There's lots of places, I think. And I think in Europe they'd probably really get it. It's kind of, it's pretty, it's kind of avant-garde, but also just beautiful. I mean, Mark Hoyle's designs are just, it's like the Met Gala. They're just stunning.
Oh, yes, the costumes are absolutely beautiful.
Absolutely stunning, yeah. So, and the music's beautiful. I said to Julian, I said, I want music that sounds classical and has that beauty, that lyric beauty that I love about opera, but has a modern edge to it. I'm all for, but I think opera went through a thing where to get modernised, it felt like it had to break everything that it had been before, and it became very atonal. And I think we had to probably go through that process to get somewhere else. But I don't want to lose what I love about opera, which is just that beautiful tunes. But without dumbing it down, I think,
Yeah, and making it very contemporary as well.
Yeah, I think the story has to be contemporary. And as I said, it's not just about putting a leather jacket on and hoping for the best.
So how many, like you've got a couple already that you're, like one that's already up and one that you're thinking?
So Lorelei, the one with Opera Queensland, we're, well on the way. And then I've got 2 other pieces just in various stages of research and development.
Wow, so that's that's a lot.
Yeah, look, those 2, one of them I've got most of the creative team together, and it's based on a real woman's life, a Melbourne
Can you tell us now?
Well, yeah, it's actually a fascinating story. It's based on Elsie Williams, who was second generation of African descent woman born in Bendigo at the turn of the century, and
yes,
she was really fascinating, and it's based all around this area in the West Melbourne swamps, Dudley Flats,
yep,
which was a little bit of a kind of sort of shanty town around the Great Depression.
I think you've actually spoken about this on my Sunday Art Show.
Yeah, I think I have, because I'm really fascinated. I've been, looking at and researching the story for a long time. And then the last piece is a longer term, bit further down the line, but that's looking at the Little Lon area and the beginnings of the red light district in the 1830s, 1840s in Melbourne. Another really great time.
Ali, how did you find out about it?
Oh, do you know what? I was really into Mercamora. I still am. I love Mercamora. I read a book about Georgia Mercamora, and I found out that the only reason they came to Melbourne was they read the book that La Boheme was based on.
Yeah.
It was like Scènes de la Boheme. And in it, the character that became Marcello in the opera was a guy whose name has just momentarily been lost from my old lady brain, but he actually spent a lot of time in Melbourne. He ran a little French bar, came out for the gold rush, and then ended up in Paris, died of consumption or something like that. But they went, oh, Melbourne, this sounds like there's bohemians in Melbourne. And they came out, of course there wasn't. He was the only one. He'd gone back to Paris. And they had to, create their own bohemian lifestyle. But that led me to looking at this kind of, they call it the Paris End. And the reason was there was this little European quarter in the gold rush that they, and it sort of the red light district at the same time, there was money, the government house was built up there, and they needed something to do in between, writing bills. And also the beginnings of Chinatown. It was a really just rich time of Melbourne's history. I'm a born and bred Melburnian, so I'm really fascinated in that. It was actually Clive Scott from the Sofitel who I had a meeting with about something else, who, when I was talking about that, he said, oh, well, of course there was the shanty town in West Melbourne. I was like, what? I've never heard about this. And he told me about the hoi polloi of Melbourne used to, sort of slum it in the slums and go down, and there was like these sort of illegal gin joints and people singing and stuff. And the more I dug into that, I found out about Elsie and was just like, this is this incredible person. And also, a lot of people talk about African immigration as being a really new thing, but there were people of African descent in the First Fleet. There were whalers who came out. There was one particular whaler who had a lot of illegitimate children. There've been, African migrants to Australia for a really long time, but people don't talk about that. I felt like that was a really interesting part. Yeah. And, the West Melbourne swamps was a real melting pot of just immigration and a really fascinating kind of time of Melbourne's history as well. Yeah. So I was really super interested to
you've got to follow through it. Can't wait to see that. Sounds absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, well now we're just trying to get lots money for it through government and philanthropic funding and stuff. But I just think it's about time we start telling our stories. Yeah. There's so much out there that we don't know. I know more about the Wild West in America than I do about the gold rush here. And
I agree.
My family all come from Ballarat. There's just so much great history that we haven't, kind of know about Ned Kelly, and that's like it.
Yeah.
So and there's so many stories to tell, and the way in which we've interacted with Indigenous Australians and migrants to this country, and really fascinating stories to tell. So, and I think opera's a really great format for that. When I heard about Elsie, who ended her life singing "My Man Threw Me in the Fire," and she was a great singer, and people didn't know if she thought, oh, it's Elsie singing, but she was actually singing for her life, and she was dying on this smouldering heap. Whoa. Someone had put corrugated iron over so the feral dogs wouldn't get her. Oh. And that's the way she died. And I just listened to that and thought, that's opera.
The tragedy.
Yeah, it's so big and grand and tragic, but also just, grandiose. Yeah.
Keep that mind going. It sounds as if it will never stop, which is wonderful. Ali McGregor, what a treat having you on the show today.
Oh, it's been great. I love talking about myself, David. It's been fabulous. No one else, my kids don't care.
But they can watch this now.
They
can
won't.
watch it. No, they won't. Or when they're older, they can watch it. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
You've been watching The Art Hunter. I'm David Hunt, and you'll see us again real soon. Bye.